Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Switched to a new computer, and the green screen settings are a little weird. But anyway, you can see me nice and clear, I think. All right, we're going to continue with Eric von Kunnelt-Ledeen. His case against democracy is going to widen into a comparison between democracy and monarchy today. A lot of our friends find this topic very interesting. I think you will too. Keep an open mind. It's if you're not used to hearing someone seriously defend monarchy as a form of government, it might come as a sort of a shock to your system. But it's worth considering. Before I bring Ryan on, I'll just say that welcome to new subscribers, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I encourage you to do that. We only do this once a week, and I try to make every episode count with real depth. So let's get rolling. Howdy, Ryan Turnipseed from Oklahoma.
Hello, how are you, Radlib?
Very good, and I would just ask if folks in the chat would make sure, let me know if you can hear us both. Well, as I mentioned, I switched to a new computer. Oh, I forgot to mention that. Yes, thanks to some wonderful donations, I have been able to get a new computer, which I desperately needed for more than one reason, but one big reason was the show. And so I'm actually running on that new computer, and that's part of the reason that, we just were throwing settings together. And yeah, somebody said spooky. My background is looking a little spooky. Yeah, what's the one where there's a tape? Everybody who watches the tape gets sucked into the TV or something. I never watched it, but anyway. I'm afraid I'm looking a little like that. There is a background noise. Yeah, I bet it just went away right now because it was probably the refrigerator kicking on because my office is in our food pantry. Honestly speaking, that's just the case. So anyway, hopefully it won't be too bad. Okay. Let's see. What do we want to say? I think that's all. Oh yeah, just again, just wanted to say I was able to get a really good computer, and we're going to see the benefit of it soon, I think. Oh, they say it might be coming from you.
I have no clue what that might be if it is, because
Sounds quiet.
It is dead silent in here.
Huh. Okay. Noise has ceased. Yeah. It's
Okay,
it's the fridge. The fridge had kicked on and then it kicked off. Yeah. So anyway, sorry about that, guys. I don't have the independent wealth to create a whole studio room just for the purpose of doing this show, as nice as that would be. Gonna have to grow the show a lot more before I can pull off something like that. Okay.
That's a good goal to work towards, I think.
Yeah, he says it's the right. Sorry, let me check. Yeah, it is. It's just picking up. Wait a sec. Talking to the producer. We're scrambling at the last minute here. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so we're going to leave us here, despite the noise back there, because our first... we're going to try to cover two things. We'll see if we can do it today. This is actually... this is actually just two chapters from two different books on this topic.
Right.
They're both pretty meaty. So we'll see which way we take it. We might go slower and end up having to do another show just to cover the Hapa. Or what I'm hoping we'll do is we'll kind of keep it moving and hopefully get you interested so that you can dig in on your own to this great stuff.
Right.
So two things that we want to cover to address this topic. First is chapter 4 from the book we were already going through by Eric von Kunnelt-Ledeen, which is called Liberty or Equality. And chapter 4 is called Democracy and Monarchy. And then Professor Hoppe has a chapter in his Democracy, the God That Failed. Chapter 3 of that book is called On Monarchy, Democracy, Public Opinion, and Delegitimation. We would not be covering the public opinion and delegitimation parts, which are really interesting. See the stream that I did with Academic Agent did that I was on De La Boite, and that addressed some of those things. But the monarchy democracy part is the meat of that chapter, and that's what we hope to cover. So anyway, those are our sources. So let's see. Okay, so let's start with Knut Ledeen. Explain his opening Kierkegaard quote really quick,
So,
since you're the resident music guy.
Yeah, and Kierkegaard as well. So he opens the chapter with a quote from Soren Kierkegaard. The hatred for the monarchical principle has gone so far that people want to have 4-part solos. And as a musician, when I first read this, it was hilarious because when people demand a 4-part solo, usually it's a musician from the orchestra, just some peasant, if you will. They usually aren't. Contrast this to the social point that Kierkegaard is trying to make. You have people demanding it from, the peasantry. They want to have the spotlight. They want to have the all of the attention on them. They want to have the responsibility of it. And something else that a solo does as well, usually everyone else is either playing background or they are silent to let the soloist play. In doing so and demanding the solo, you're also shutting up the rest of the orchestra and all of their talents. So, it's a very, very deep quote, as with the rest of Kierkegaard's work, if you ever read into him. A lot to unpack there, but it's a very, very funny quote, I thought.
Yeah, and that always grabs me because I'm a personal fan of Kierkegaard.
Right.
I read him more as a Christian, I guess. I like his meditations on scripture and stuff like that more than as a philosopher, I guess. Though it's all of a piece. Okay, so first thing he does is remind us of some of the points that were made that we covered last time, that were done in the beginning of the book. Government. So he's saying, you have the little town meeting, New England town meeting, or the small canton, and he says that you could argue is, a people governing itself, but the mass democracy, in case you haven't noticed, does not feel like self-government, right? My feeling of being in this democracy in the United States, for example, is that I'm very powerless and things are being done to me and I can't really do anything about it. I feel very disenfranchised by the system. And I think that's his point, right?
Right. Your one vote in a mass democracy has extremely little leverage just because of votes in the country.
Right. So he says, they sell democracy as self-government, but those who experience it know it doesn't really work that way, right? Okay, so number 2, it is emotional, at best irrational. Democracy is emotional, at best irrational, and often anti-rational and anti-intellectual. This is particularly amusing point right in our current year, Ryan, because I think the people who would be sort of little d Democrats right now are all about saying that they're about the science, right? They advertise themselves as being extremely rational. Some of us beg to differ.
Well, right, and if you take these words at just their base meaning, what we see right now in the current year is anti-rational and anti-intellectual. You're not allowed to think. You're not allowed to deviate from the party line. they will destroy you if you do have an intellect.
Right. Yeah, independent thinkers are, well, they're generally fired at this point, it seems to me. They tend to lose their job. Okay, number 3, it is corrupting in most of its implications and thus morally dangerous. I don't know how much, we'll see, I'm forgetting. I don't think he spells that out very much in this chapter, maybe. But Hoppe actually really, I think, brings this point out really well. So hopefully we'll get to Hoppe, because he really develops that.
I don't know how much in relation to Hoppe necessarily. I'm not qualified to make that judgment, but Knut Ledeen does do a great job at describing how democracy will warp a traditional institution. So I think he does do a good job at explaining that.
The corruption of institutions, right.
Right.
4, it is wasteful from the point of view of the human material. 5, it is historically bound up with the liberal heresy, sectarian liberalism, with the despair of the attainability of objective truth, and with the maladies of militarism, ethnic nationalism, and racialism. Now, this is quite interesting. He uses liberal in a negative sense here, though he calls himself an arch-liberal. And it's partially because of Knut Ledeen's influence that I have not been ready to back down from defending the term liberal. But it is a contested term. So even Knut Ledeen himself uses it here in a negative sense and in other places in a positive sense as representing what he is about, right, as an arch-liberal. But he calls it the liberal heresy or sectarian liberalism, trying to say that there is a flavor of liberalism that is quite bad, is very bound up with democracy. That's not what Knut Ledeen stands for. He stands for a different kind of liberalism.
And we've talked about that before, where you have social democrats that try to brand themselves as liberals because of its, it has a good foundation, very consistent with Christianity, which we might be able to discuss today, depending on where you take the show. Yeah. And it, has a lot of sway with people. It has a good connotation. Social democrats brand themselves as liberals, and now suddenly liberal has 2 completely opposite meanings.
Right, it's a sort of stolen valor thing in my view. Okay, let me see something here. Okay, I don't have to keep flipping to that screen. Okay, so let's see. It is and the militarism point, as folks may know, I'm not big on empire and war generally, and so that point jumps out to me, and that may seem an unusual point because we get a lot of propaganda that basically those other bad guys started, and the United States, for example, is always just defending freedom or something. One of the key things I've learned over the years is that much of the history that allows them to tell that story is lies.
Right. Yes.
And many of the wars, as far as I can tell, nearly all of them that the United States has been involved with, involved false flags.
Right. They were aggressive in nature.
Yeah, they were aggressive wars. So I'm picking on the United States in particular, but there is a larger point about the connection between democracy and militarism that can be made. 6, it is because of its egalitarianism, teleologically incompatible with liberty. So he's saying that liberty, as we tried to share his arguments last time, liberty has to do with letting people be their different selves. We aren't naturally the same. We're naturally different.
Right.
Liberty encourages that, permits it, allows it to flourish. Democracy has a leveling impact. It is bound up with the notion of egalitarianism, which, from the title of his book, hopefully you picked it up, Liberty or Equality. Knut Ledeen sees egalitarianism and liberty as incompatible principles. He sees democracy and egalitarianism, though, as going together. but that's not a compliment to democracy from his point of view.
Right. You can summarize liberty in this regard as it requires and it allows inequality. You can't have liberty without inequality, and liberty will in turn create inequality, but that is a good thing.
Right.
Democracy levels it or tries to destroy it.
Right.
Perhaps I shouldn't have said level because that has other connotations elsewhere.
Yeah. 7, it is the last step in the political evolution towards the modern form of tyranny. We'll see more on that.
Right.
8, it prospers only with the support of strict, semi-totalitarian or totalitarian societies, exercising control in the form of horizontal pressure. This is a really interesting point. He's going to get into it more, but I just want to call your attention to pay attention on this. This is something I associated with John Stuart Mill, an argument I associate with John Stuart Mill, and I have tended to poo-poo it as, there's a place for healthy peer pressure, right? But at least the way Connaught-Ledeen takes Mill's point, in his rightist way, right-wing way, he sees this as really toxic, where the free society allows, think about England, the tradition of the English eccentric, someone who is kind of a little bit of an oddball. Everyone kind of chuckles about them, but they're tolerated. They're not driven out of society, and they don't get this tremendous pressure on them to, get with it, buddy, and be like everybody else, or we will crush you like a bug. Connaught-Ledeen says this is something that democracy goes toward, that horizontal pressure, where the person who is independent-minded, eccentric, whatever, comes under tremendous pressure. Of course, it's not just social, is what we're seeing now. It ultimately ends up having the state behind it, right?
Right.
9, it is collectivistic and anti-personalistic. This is a great emphasis of his. I really like it. What allows the flourishing of personality and what crushes personality, right?
Right, yes. And those two put together are especially bad because we've discussed before, and everyone else around us at multiple times, that collectivism is not in and of itself bad, right? You can have a collective, but whenever you combine that with anti-personalism, you actively destroy the parts of the parts of the body, the parts of the collective, and force them to become uniform. You homogenize them, and we discussed at great length a couple of weeks ago why that is a bad thing. And if you know your theology, it's also a bad thing spiritually.
Right. Okay. And then finally, this is a point that we are not going to explore, but just for completeness, I'm going to share it because Connaught-Ledeen was a Catholic, and he spends a later part of the book, I think, really hammering on number 10
yes.
here. A part of the book I'm probably not going to have us cover, but he says, democracy failed for these and other reasons in Catholic Europe and flourished in Protestant countries only. So he gets in a dig there, and he spends a lot of time trying to prove that point. But that's not of interest to me to go down that path. So, and I got to hold Ryan back because he would love to spend the show talking about that, but we're not going to do it.
Just thinking of Germany, I just see democracy forced on them at gunpoint by the Entente. Wasn't previously, kind of. I don't really see it flourishing there. But anyways, back to the show.
Okay, right. So, having summarized a bit of his concerns about democracy, now let's turn. What's the point of this chapter? As he says, he says. He says, in the next chapter, we will continue our investigation along these lines, singling out a specific form of government as a means of comparison. So he's saying, and that's what I try to do in the show Marketing, right? To say, okay, somebody could hear all these criticisms of democracy and say, well, yeah, but compared to what? Sure,
Right.
I agree with you. All those things are true, but every other form of government is worse, right? It has all those things and even other things that are on top of it, right, Ryan?
Right, yeah. To summarize, he opens the chapter after that list by saying, it is certain that our critical remarks on the failings of democracy, in spite of their severity, have a relative value only. And I think that pretty well encapsulates, what we
Right.
would say on the topic.
Right, exactly. So this is why, to complete the critique of democracy, both he and, as we'll hopefully see, Hoppe have to start comparing it to other things, right?
Right.
Otherwise, someone can always counter and just say, "Yeah, you're right. I see those things about democracy, but what can you do? It's the best we can do." Both Knolt
Right.
Ledeen and Hoppe want to urge us that it is not the best we can do. In fact, we have a long history of doing something better than what we now just assume must be the way the world is. I just can't overemphasize a certain point. So many of the things that feel like they'll just always be that way, they're really quite recent. It's really quite a modern thing in history. The nation state as we know it, the large nation state, the large consolidated nation state that has just tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people in it. The democracy being everywhere, the abolition of a tie to gold or silver and the replacement with fiat currency. So many of these things are just you look at the span of recorded human history, several plus thousand years. This is just a little bit right at the end that we're having these things. We have so much history
Right.
to draw on that shows us there are other ways to operate. So, it's very presentist, very short-sighted to say we'll never see anything again but the way it has been for the last 90 years or 200 years, right?
Right. And especially within the last century, you see the rise of mass democracy as a system, very distinct from whatever came before it. And to utilize mass democracy, you also have to utilize a great amount of propaganda and indoctrination among the population in order to keep power. And our elites have done that in the US and the United Kingdom and everywhere else in Europe that have been subjected to mass democracy. With mass democracy came mass media, and mass media does an excellent job at writing propaganda and indoctrinating the population. They took over the schooling systems and the universities. They took over the televisions, the radios. They have very well utilized everything to make us feel like it was always this way.
Yes, and I mean, I was affected by this. Let me be clear. I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad. I was affected by this, and to meet Knolt Ledeen, to hear him speak publicly in a room full of hundreds of eminent people against democracy, to shoot me down when I tried to weakly defend it, to read Hoppe, Democracy, the God That Failed, etc., etc. These things were a paradigm shift for me. No one taught me about this stuff when I was little. It was the typical, I went to a government school, and it was the typical, those were the bad old days, and everybody was just poor and miserable. And, thank goodness that we are in the best time ever of, democracy and freedom and equality, and all this stuff is so great. It took some work, some sort of stepping outside of the perspective that was hammered into me to go, oh, maybe it isn't what they keep telling me it looks like. It really overturned my thinking in so many ways.
Right.
Go ahead.
One of the inherent flaws of mass media is by the fact that it is so massive, you are going to find that it is not all completely uniform. There are going to be people that go against the mold. So, you will have peasants from the population. I mean, unless one of us is hiding some secret hereditary estate or wealth, I think that we all fit that description, in our circles at least. There are going to be people that will eventually find their way back to how things were. It's just not going to be anything close to a majority. So it's not all doom and gloom necessarily.
Okay, so let's get into it. He says, okay, we're going to compare monarchy to democracy. What kind of monarchy are we going to talk about? He wants to narrow his focus a little bit. He's talking about the hereditary monarchy, operating through an officialdom, but possessing local organs of self-government and opinionating bodies with moral weight. He said, now this surprised me. Not the feudal medieval monarchy. That's what I would have been more interested in, I think.
Right.
But rather the enlightened absolutism of Maria Theresa should serve us as a means of comparison. We do not consider it to be the best type, nor the worst, but rather a pure type.
Right. And he is also, from the republic or the democracy side, eliminating the hereditary aristocracies of like Florence, Genoa, Venice, those types. So they aren't in comparison.
Right. So in both cases, I think his strategy here is let's try to get a clearer picture by pushing to the extremes a little bit. A very monarchical monarchy and a very democratic democracy, as opposed to a mixed system where the elements of monarchy and democracy are mixed up together. Because we're trying to tease out the impact of the democratic element and the monarchical element. So if we spend time looking at something where it's all mixed together, it's hard to draw any conclusions, right? Okay, so having set the stage, okay, so he talks about. Well, go ahead. Where do we take it?
He also talks about the common good before we leave this part of the chapter.
Yeah.
And he makes a very, very great point that the common good, trademark or whatever you want, quote unquote, it can't be summed up in a simple formula. It abounds, moreover, with inner conflicts and choices. The present pagan tendency of seeing in the common good the sum total of material advantages for the community, regardless of the sacrifice of immaterial values, has to be thoroughly rejected. Even John Stuart Mill, who had opposed an orthodox utilitarianism, had warning words on this subject. So,
yeah. So I mean, this is like the line go up view of life, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
If we can just say, go ahead. Uh-oh.
Hold on.
Oh, there we go. You're back.
Sorry, my connection dropped. So, basically everything that you've been told and indoctrinated with since the public schools, since birth, essentially, about the common good, throw it out. It's something else. Don't even think about it for this analysis.
Right, and so I was saying that one way of looking at this is the thing we make fun of, the line go up, hey, the stock market's up, so what are you whining about? Just a pure a numerical materialist view of things. And he says that's not, you don't get a flourishing society in that way. Okay, so the essence of monarchy. I'm trying to figure out what I want to highlight from this.
So, I have something from the first paragraph if you want me to start with that.
Yeah.
Alright, so, he says, whereas an average Frenchman might easily imagine his country being transformed into an absolutistic. Yeah, sorry. An absolute monarchy, a plebiscitarian monarchy, a military dictatorship, an anarchic syndicalist federation, or a communist tyranny, an American, fortunately we must say, has not the same doubtful advantage. In comparison with a revolutionary and deeply divided Europe, plastered with an endless amount of thin historical layers, the American monolith tends towards conservatism. And here, conservatism just means the status quo, what it has been.
Right.
So, he is getting, before he even delves into, what a monarchy is, he is recognizing the fact that, most of his audience, because this is in English, it's going to be Americans, they can't even imagine living under, a monarchy on the soil. It's unthought of, unheard of, incomprehensible.
Yeah, and I actually like this next point because I've often made it in my own words. He says, if by some magic the present Constitution and governmental institutions were removed, the 153 million Americans at that time would be faced by an absolute political void. He's saying there'd be nothing to fall back on. I don't know. I don't know if that's totally fair, but I see his point. That the way I put it is, if our current generation had to scrap the Constitution and write a new one, we'd be shooting each other in the streets within weeks. I mean, we are riding on the inheritance of that, Constitution, which I am very critical of, but it is relatively sane compared to, you can just imagine, right? A new Constitution would be environmentalism and equity and every stupid idea, and it would not work. It just wouldn't work, and we would have conflict, terrible conflict.
Right. Or a different point that's also being made is that we just have not had, since our independence, a different governmental institution. In the United Kingdom, if you take away we're in theory, so it doesn't matter how practical it is. If Parliament just vanished from the United Kingdom, besides the shouts of joy you might hear in the streets, the monarchy is still there.
Right.
If you take away the monarchy, Parliament is still there, right? You get both directions you can go.
Right.
In France, they've tried just about everything. They can fall back on one of them. We don't have that. If you take away our Republican form of government, what are you going to go back to?
We're in trouble. Yeah, we're in trouble. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting side point. Okay. I like this. Sorry, again, sticking on the U.S., he says, the unhistorical notion that republics are more progressive than the backward monarchies already creates an initial prejudice. Yeah, so I was confessing to the ways that I remember thinking. Well, I can remember it because I, met Canola Dean, read Hoppe, and I could see how I can remember how I was reacting, right? And it's just like baked into our gut that monarchy is like this old backwards thing. Right. It's just they just slam us with this somehow.
Right, and ever since I remember reading children's books where if the topic of a king ever came up, they would usually contrast it with like a president or something, and the king is always in like black and white. There's peasants in the field, and then the presidents, it's in color, it's shiny. Yeah, people dressed in suits and all of that. Like even from a young age, most Americans just get hit with all forms of messaging that a monarchy has to be backwards and a republic has to be progressive. They aren't necessarily the other way around. They are independent qualities.
Okay, but anyway, I'm not going to try to spell out, unless you want to. I wasn't going to try to spell out more of what he says next. But I did. No,
I think we've made the point.
Yeah, I did like this next. Let's see. He says he quotes Ernst Bruncken, a Napoleonic tyranny, a dictatorship. This is easily within the realm of Americans' comprehensions, but a legitimate monarchy seems to the American a simple absurdity, and he cannot understand how otherwise quite intelligent people can have faith in such a thing. So, yeah, I think that's right. I think, before getting Hoppe and Canola Dean pilled, I would say that monarchy seemed to me sort of like a superstitious kind of a thing. Like the only way you could be in a monarchy is if you also believed in, I was going to say witchcraft, but that's not right. you also believed in various other strange superstitious ideas. It's not something that a rational person would adopt or argue for. I think that's where I was
Right,
coming from.
and being as I was so immersed in American history for so long, you read about the times where America could have become a monarchy in its form of government, and every single time I remember just laughing at it because of how implausible it would never happen. There's no way that, America could become so centralized in such a formal system. And, well, I mean, you're essentially there today just with an oligarchy instead of a formal monarchy.
Right.
He makes a point right after that quote, which I think might be good for some people that still hold on to, well, we don't want democracy or a monarchy. We've got the republic and, the founders to hold back on there. People are still out there. He said, this is perhaps surprising when we remember that the Declaration of Independence in no way attacks the institution of monarchy, but merely disqualifies George III for his high office. So, if you read through the Declaration of Independence, I have it with me, it lists off, grievances, what has happened, where the king has failed, but it never says the king has an office that is false in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Every single thing is saying, well, if the king was just doing his job, these things would not have happened. They have happened, therefore it is within our natural rights to revolt.
Right.
And Knut Ledeen goes on to say, the whole growth of our Christian civilization is politically interwoven with the institution of monarchy. And that's a statement that just can't be disputed. It's
Right.
true just because European history played out in the way it did.
Yeah, so as we've covered before on this show and talking about the Industrial Revolution, the Middle Ages, and maybe some other topics, Christendom, the history of the European peoples for the last, for the 1,500 years or something preceding the very recent past, has basically been smeared and lied about.
Right.
Right, and so to say that hey, we have a wonderful heritage. What did it grow up under? It grew up under the influence of Christianity. It grew up under the institution of monarchy. Just thinking that way is not it's like brain short circuit already. Just starting to say something like that, even though it's all pretty much factual, unless you just have this new view that everything about Europe is poison, and nothing ever good came from that whole history or something, But if you value that heritage, then it's just a fact. It was heavily influenced by Christianity, and honest atheists and agnostics like Rothbard, for example, acknowledge it, frankly, right? Because it's just obviously true.
Right.
Well, so also it's true that it was monarchical in form for a long, long time.
Right.
Until very recently.
Of differing flavors. Each region, we talked about this last week, each region's going to have its own culture with its own laws that develop naturally. So too, Christianity, interwoven with these monarchical governments and their cultures, is going to produce something different by the region. So the Polish monarchy will not look the same as the English monarchy, and you can make that case for all of Europe. It's a beautiful thing that just gets erased with the same democracy being imposed on each and every country.
Right, so continuing with this point in Ledeen just a little bit more, he says it must not be forgotten that the Christian European monarchy was through most of its history of a constitutional pattern, which circumscribed and limited the ruler's sphere of action by the law of God and the law of the land. So that is another mistake I remember having in my head that I had to clear up. And that is the idea that a monarch, a king, was basically like a dictator. Like a Stalin or something. But Knut Ledeen says, well, but that's just not what the history was. The monarch wasn't free to just do whatever the hell they wanted to do. In fact, as AA would tell you, even dictators aren't. But anyway, never mind that for a moment. They weren't free to just do whatever they wanted to do. because they were viewed as under God and under God's law. And if they went too far afield with that, they would lose legitimacy in everyone's eyes. You know,
Right.
how can you be a Christian?
Before...
How can you be a Christian king of a Christian people, and do that? Right. That was a question that was always threatening, limiting their action.
And even before you had written constitutions, you had either unwritten or sometimes written different codes where if you were to be in this aristocratic and regal scene, you had to follow them. Otherwise, you were just as bad as some commoner out there. You had a different standard that you were held to, where if you didn't follow it, not only did you look bad to your people, but also the other royal families of Europe, and that's a very, very bad thing. If you are just isolated in the center of Europe, or in the center of an island that has multiple different kingdoms bordering you. You had to act that way, and since it's not just a bunch of faceless bureaucrats that are running the country, it is, a family or a king or, something along those lines, they can have personal conviction that will drive their actions. Faith. They can have faith in the Christian religion and follow it, whereas under a democracy or a republic, you do not get nearly that effect with 100 people or 1,000 people governing and ruling your country.
Okay, so here we go. So, Knut Ledeen is going to make some comments about monarchy that are coming from such a different angle than we're used to thinking. It's going to be challenging. So just be ready. He starts this section with a quote. Francis Joseph was once asked by Theodore Roosevelt what he considered to be the role of a monarch in the present day and age. And Francis Joseph replied, to protect my nations from their governments. Right, so...
Perfect.
Right, so the monarch is, in this view, on the side of the peoples, maybe not the people in the modern sort of French Revolutionary sense that we're used to thinking, but of peoples, right? The monarch is on the side of the peoples against the governments. That is the ruling the ruling apparatus that is nominally below the king, right? Now, this shouldn't, given that we just went through 4 years of Trump, this idea shouldn't seem so crazy, right? Because what we saw was Trump, supposedly, and we can debate that another time, but supposedly Trump was trying to stand with the people, at least like the middle class maybe, and was opposed by the governing structure, which we now call the deep state. So if Trump, if somebody said to Trump, "What are you doing?" and he said, "I'm trying to protect the people of the United States from the deep state," that would have been a plausible explanation for what he thought he was up to, right? So this shouldn't be too foreign of a concept for us to think this way.
And with the current monarch, with the monarch in question for the quote as well, Austria-Hungary, if you remember some of their history at the very least towards the end, you had all these different ethnicities that had different governing councils, and there's a hierarchy of them. So like the Austrian or the Hungarian government had superiority over the others. What would often happen would be that you'd have these smaller ethnic groups like Croats or Serbs or something along those lines that would appeal straight to the monarchy to help them against their current governing structure because they were bad in some way, shape, or form. Which, I mean, we don't have that now, and if you know how the story of Austria-Hungary ends, it ultimately didn't work for various reasons, but the sheer fact that there is a figure that does have power that can protect you from the state, from the bureaucracy, from the representatives, it is a great thing to have.
Right. Okay, and now he turns to monarchy as a patriarchal institution. And this is a point that is very uncomfortable these days, right? We have many people who talk about, down with the patriarchy, right? Well, Knut Ledeen would say up with the patriarchy. But let's try to keep an open mind and understand what he's getting at. So he says the underlying ideology of monarchy is familialistic. That means it's family oriented. We talk about the royal family, right?
Right.
He says the ideal monarch is a father. And in fact, he says, what is it when you think of a picture of a king on a playing card or in a children's story? What does the king look like typically? He's bearded. He's middle-aged. Maybe he's an old man. He appears to be neither too young nor too smart. He's not a Superman. What does he have, though? He exudes authority. Okay? So the king is, when you generically depict a king, you depict someone who looks fatherly, basically.
Right. So, and that's how they're depicted in the different paintings that we have as well.
Right.
You know, you can think of your very major European monarchs, but if you go to just any monarch out there, usually their painting, their portrait is going to have them looking, you know, in some way like approachable, like he is the patriarch of a family in the Christian sense. So, it's it plays into the whole like the father of the nation, which I'm sure we're going to get into as we explore this idea. He not only is he you know, there for a government purpose, which would be very materialistic, he's also there to provide like fatherly guidance for the people that are under him. Not something that you get under a democracy or a republic.
Right. In fact, it's quite interesting thinking about the. This stopped with Trump and Biden, right? But thinking about U.S. presidents, we ended up with JFK, who was super young, right? It was he was sort of considered shockingly young.
And if you look at the presidents that are usually by both sides considered to be good in the modern era, like very little dispute. You get JFK because he was shot, but he was also young, very charismatic by the media at the very least. Also Theodore Roosevelt, the second youngest president, if I remember correctly, you know, did a lot of things with the government. We've discussed before, you know, not the greatest influence on the United States. Not really a father figure either, because for a lot of the time he was out on the fields fighting rather than, you know, governing the household. Very young, you know, also potentially neglectful with his family. These are, and then with JFK, a very, very much worse story, you know, openly lecherless, a very terrible father figure. We basically just see the opposites.
Good point. Okay, so what is a father in a wider sense? He's a man with full responsibility over minors, a position of respect, seniority, and leadership in relation to mature persons. And he makes a point here, which is that there's an interest which is partly personal with a monarch and partly generational, that is directed towards the ruler's family and thus transferable to the heir. So, so the whole, remember that the whole, one of the dramatic things you see, like with Henry VIII, is you want to have this male heir because that brings stability to the kingdom, right? Well, you know, fathers want to pass things on to their sons. That's a part of it. But also, it allows for there to be orderly transfer of power, because the idea is that your loyalty is not just to that specific individual, but to the royal family, to the royal line, right?
Right. And so if I may, just a very short story. My roommate and my friend is going to be a mechanical engineer, and he was talking to me about infrastructure a couple of nights ago. And he just, you know, elaborated to me the terrible state of the United States infrastructure. And we got into a discussion where we eventually concluded that a lot of the, you know, infrastructure that you see still standing in Europe that has been there between 2 millennia and a few hundred years, you know, we barely have that in the U.S., things make it 100 years. what you see in Europe is what you saw people investing in infrastructure that were monarchs, emperors, something along that line. They had an interest in making sure that their nation, because they were the king of that nation, the monarch of that nation, they had an interest in making sure that their infrastructure was good. It was a prestige thing, it was a personable thing, it was an efficiency thing, but it was also, just their duty as the monarch. They had a family thing, so you don't want to pass on a bad house or a bad road to your son if it's your kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also had, a power thing. How am I going to look on the international scale? How powerful is my kingdom? We can't just be invaded or something like that.
Right.
So, in the United States, however, politicians just care about their term. They're usually there towards the end of their life. They aren't passing it down to their children. Pay for the cheapest thing possible that works, makes me look good now, makes it look like I got something good with a little amount of money, and then it collapses in 2 decades.
Right, right. So there's less of a sense of, less of an orientation towards a long-lasting legacy. Right.
Right.
And we'll see that that's no accident that it works that way. Okay, few more quick quotes on the father thing. In a traditional monarchy, the relationship between king and subject is that of a middle-aged father and his mature son, not that of a young father and an infant. This is in contrast to Spinoza's idea that a monarchy is a form of government in which subjects are treated like children. And Knoll-Ledeen says, no, that's not really what you see. There is a father aspect to it, but it's a mature father with a middle-aged father with a mature son. That's more the analogy. The
Right.
Catholic world, essentially patriarchal in nature, had a variety of fathers, not only physical fathers and kings, but also patres, confessors, spiritual fathers, and in Rome, a holy father. You've probably heard the Pope called the Holy Father, right?
Right.
Above them was the Father in heaven, creator as well as regent. God is king, right?
Right.
The king was the father of his people, only because every father was king in his family. So here's one conservative, little c conservative, or big C conservative take on this. Knoll-Ledeen is saying that a king is going to promote family values to some degree, just by the nature
Right.
of a monarchy. It is family oriented, and so he is a father of his own family. He is in some sense, a father as king of his people, and so he's supportive of fathers. Don't want to go down the whole rabbit hole of the men's rights activism, but it is interesting if you get a chance to look at some of the things they have highlighted about how fathers are under sustained attack by the system at this point. Rather than being supported, they're being undermined in many, many ways.
And also having, a father with a large family, that is the center of what they do. Like, that is their core to lead you. That is something that's also been lacking, at the very least in my generation, and probably ones before that. My big thing has been saying that Generation Z, the Zoomers, they don't really have role models. If you had people leading you where they are the rightful patriarch of their family, they have many children that have turned out well because of their parenting, but also because of their like actual ability. That would be a role model. That would be something that we desperately need right now, but it was taken away from us centuries before.
Okay, so he says this is a very again, Knoll-Ledeen comes at things from such a fresh angle. It's really rewarding, I think. He says we have to look at political institutions from the point of view of cultural harmony. That is, how do they fit in with the other aspects of our life, right? Since the patriarchal relationship dominates in the theological, ecclesiastic, and biological sphere, that means we have fathers, human fathers. We have, pastors who have a sort of spiritually fatherly role. We have God the Father. He says, it is psychologically not easy to organize political life along egalitarian and numeralistic lines. So he says, it's kind of strange. We have like these spheres of our life that are cut off from each other. In our family life, even today, for many of us still, there is something like a patriarchal structure. But then we go to politics and it's all about egalitarianism.
Right.
Or fraternalism, fraternité, going to the French Revolution, right?
Right. So, this is an especially good point because, as he later mentions, if you just recognize this and acknowledge that everywhere in life there is going to be a patriarchal organization, politics is not special. It is not different. It is just human relations. It goes very well as a counter against atomizing people, against the atomized individuals. Like, to quote the guy himself, and remember this was the 50s, he says, "Thus the breaking up of the pattern of existence in our atomistic age has certainly not fostered the development of true personality." He was recognizing this, close to 70 or so years ago.
Yep.
We're in an atomistic age. We're beyond that because this was he was calling the 50s, right? I haven't gotten that wrong.
The early 50s, yeah.
Yeah, he was calling the early 50s, like, he was recognizing people are atomized individuals. Today, we see the 50s as it wasn't the best by any measure, but it wasn't, the worst either. It led us here. If they were the atomized individuals, then where on earth are we?
Yeah, right.
So
we're much farther down the road.
Got me thinking while I was reading. Yeah.
Yeah, so his claim here is, he says the patriarchal idea in recent times has been greatly weakened, and as we know now, it's just outright attacked, right? Smash the patriarchy, many people would say. He says, even despite that, the father-son relationship is and remains an ineradicable element in the psychological structure of societies. And then he gets into Freud, which is interesting. By the way, Mises was a right-wing Freudian as well. They have a sort of a different take on these things, He says, he says it is natural to have reverence and affection for one's father. It is natural to have a desire for being or becoming a father. It is also natural to have a fatherly and benevolent interest in those who are, for some reason or other, our charges. Right? So it's funny. We have a schizophrenic society, right? Because on the one hand, it smashed the patriarchy. On the other hand, it's you were a terrible father. You neglected your children. You abused your children. You shouldn't have done that. Well, what should I have done? Should I have been a better patriarch? Maybe? Right? What do you want?
Right.
Right?
Right. The society around us now, it completely demands the best of the masculine elements while also completely decrying the fact that they exist.
Right.
It's nothing new. This has been going on for over a century now. But it is a very prudent point to note that the society is schizophrenic. And, we'll get into this later. Democracy has a very feminine element to it, whereas the monarchy, as we've been discussing, has a paternal element to it. Perhaps it might be down to the old, the feminine can't decide.
Okay, so let me read this real quick because he's going to continue to use monarchy as a way to critique democracy and tyranny, right, which he says democracy leads to. Although we all more or less crave recognition, like to be esteemed or listened to, we also have a tendency to follow others, whose superior qualities we readily recognize or whom we consider to have been placed by a generally accepted custom in a position of command and leadership. So he's making a simple observation here. I remember just this week seeing something about, look at this terrible thing where we did this experiment and people are looking to the people around them and taking a cue from them, and they should just be independently minded and do the right thing. Well, man is a social animal, okay? So get real. What Knut Ledeen is saying is just the truth. We do look to others. There are social hierarchies. And I think Jordan Peterson's quite good on this. In fact, he says, yes, these hierarchies can become tyrannical and abusive, but when they're functioning correctly, they allow flourishing, right? Anyway,
Right.
he continues, our soul is not a windowless monad, but it rejoices in loving command and proud service. And then he has a parenthetical comment. That's why I wanted to read all this. It is only the inferior man who indulges in arrogant supremacy and servile inferiority, the stigma of false hierarchies. So he says there is a healthy way to have hierarchy, and part of the reason we get turned off to it is because the hierarchies that we see are sick and screwed up, right?
Right.
When you see a dictator, and people, the communist dictator and everybody clapping until somebody passes out because they're afraid to be the first one to stop clapping. This is not loving command and proud service, right? That Canola Dean's holding up. This is arrogant supremacy and servile inferiority, right? So Canola Dean is not being low IQ here and just saying all hierarchy is great. He's saying, no. There is a healthy form of hierarchy. He talks here, right? He says we have a tendency to follow others whose superior qualities we readily recognize. Well, if I want to have my car fixed, and fixing cars is not the main focus of my life, which it isn't, and I find someone who's good at fixing cars, then I treat them with respect, and I listen to them when they tell me what they think's wrong with the car. I might ask them some pointed questions, right? But I recognize their superior ability, superior quality in this area. So there's a hierarchy in that moment. That mechanic is above me and I'm below him, but it's not in a servile way, right? It's a relationship of respect.
The whole reason that we need to spell this out, what a good hierarchy is, what a good relationship to someone that could be above or below you is because that got corrupted in the past few hundred years from what it naturally just was. Once upon a time, the majority of hierarchies were good. The majority of relationships were good. But they've all been destroyed, corrupted, torn down, or all three. And now we've been left with what we see today. If you mention an oligarchy, once upon a time, a very potentially legitimate form of government. We discussed at the beginning there were states that mixed elements of democracy and monarchy together that we aren't discussing.
Right.
Very legitimate. No one would say that they were failures, but whenever you think of oligarchies today, you might think of the Russian oligarchs that have a reputation for exploitation. You might think of the media moguls here in the United States that are actively destroying the country. They're very bad. They've been corrupted. So too has every other relationship along the line, down to the very basic things of marriage. They have all been corrupted and destroyed, and I think we'll get to why that is soon.
Right. Okay. And then he says, this is something that's really interesting about Canola Dean. He has this, we talked about the person and the personality, right? He has this focus on, these days I guess we would call it psychology, but that's not quite right. It's just a focus on what it is to be a human. What is it like to actually be a human? How do you relate to people? What matters to you? Right? That's what he keeps bringing up. So here's an example. He says, man doesn't naturally hanker after a sterile skepticism. He has a desire for belief. I love that because I'm rewatching X-Files with my teens, right? And he has the poster, I want to believe, on his, right? Canola Dean is saying, you could tease Mulder, right? But really, we all want to believe. We all want to believe that there is some goodness in the world and there's people we can trust, right? So he says, man wants to believe not only in truths and deities, but also with reason, measure, and clarity in persons. And isn't that true, right? It's a pretty dark world when we find no one we can trust. Everybody is going to turn us in, undermine us, counter signal, right? There's no allies.
Right.
There's just a bunch of individuals out for themselves. That's not a wonderful world to be in. Go ahead.
Even on a less extreme example, you can't do everything yourself. You are not omnipresent and omnipotent or or omniscient. You have to rely on other people for some. That's the whole basis of the division of labor. It necessitates other people doing things. You want to be able to trust them and have faith in them. Obviously, not the same kind of faith that you put in God, but faith that they are good, will do their job correctly, and that you can trust them. Yeah. It is a measure of faith because you cannot prove 100% of the time continuously that you can. That's why it's called faith. So when you break all of that down, it is a very atomized world, and not only them, the people with a declining quality, but you too are going to suffer because you can't do everything just the same way that they can't either. That brings us back to the whole overarching point. Liberalism, liberty, it necessitates inequality, and those inequalities are good.
Right, and social cooperation is what we're talking about. This is the heart in my view, of the proper liberal vision is social cooperation. And it means trust. It means being able to trust, right? He says the family is a fideistic institution. Its members have to believe in each other, right? Let's see. Sound hierarchies can only be based on affection and reason.
Before we move on the point of families being they are an institution that is inherently fideistic. He makes a point that just kind of encapsulates the whole thing. One can always speak with legal certainty of the mother. It was the principle for Roman law, but the father-son relationship in the biological order rests on faith in a woman's word. So it's not just cooperation in a very basic sense of I need to trade this, but it's also, the institution of marriage rests on faith between the spouses. So I had that highlighted before we were to move on.
Yes. Sorry, I'm so distracted by the green screen being messed up. I've got to just stop looking at myself. I cannot get the settings right. It's the lights. I need the lights. That'll fix it. Okay. Right. Okay, right. And he says, we doubt that reason alone would be a sufficient ligament for a hierarchical or any other order. So it can't be purely rationalistic. That's a part of it.
Right.
We're rational creatures, but that can't be all of it. Human nature demands the inclusion of emotional elements. And there is no doubt that among these, love is the noblest and most constructive one. Okay, so, sorry, he goes all over the place. I'm trying to figure out how to keep some focus here.
Right.
Okay, so he says, as we leave the safer ground of personal relationships built on reason and affection, and enter the realm of collective emotions, of a fraternal rather than a patriarchal order, we are already on dangerous ground. We get into animalism, anti-rationalism, egoism. I was reminded very much of Kierkegaard, who writes about the crowd.
Yes.
That when people become part of a crowd, they descend to something lower, right? They do things they would never do if you were dealing with them person to person.
Right, and it's because they're very person by the fact that they themselves have let their person become assimilated to some monolithic crowd. The person holds back things that are bad, actions that you would otherwise not do. And now that that's gone, now that you're just part of the crowd, your action is not tied to your person. You are going to act like an animal. You
lose responsibility, which is one of the things he's going to emphasize here. The loss of responsibility. He also mentioned something really interesting. He says, it is true that the general or personal enthusiasm for the monarch can, in its extreme, assume idolatrous forms. And if you've ever seen some of the panegyrics devoted to, poems devoted to the queen, and they just go over the top, right, and praising
Right.
the monarch and how wonderful they are and beautiful and blah blah blah, and it's like you're rolling your eyes, He says, so yeah, that can happen. He says collective self-worship, on the other hand, which is the psychological basis of democracy, the real source of nationalism, class pride, and racialism, is already dangerous in its initial stages. So he says, yeah, you can get crazy about being idolatrous about the monarch, but for democracy, it's about self-worship. We, the people, are awesome. We
Right.
Americans, he talks about national pride. That's, U.S. is number one kind of stuff. Class pride and racialism. So here he's taking a little poke at people who would take pride in their genetics, basically, right?
And everything
Their
else that
tribe.
goes along with race, yes.
Yeah, their tribe.
So, and in the next paragraph, I'm just going to summarize it because we've basically been talking about it the whole time here. He basically just says the whole history of Europe and its culture lies in the familial affection for rulers. So the Hungarian people will have a familial connection for their apostolic kingdom. The English will have a familial connection to their monarch, etc., etc. That is what shaped European history, the culture, and everything else that went along with it. What made it good.
Okay, one more thing from this chapter, and we better keep moving. We're moving really slow. Okay, so he says the king cannot logically be a nationalist or a racialist since his ancestors are mainly aliens. You may recall that the monarchs of Europe tended to marry each other. Queen Victoria lost a child to the Bolsheviks, and another child
Right.
was a monarch in Germany, and on, right? Because that's how it worked. They married with each other. The royal family of England or Britain is famously of German origin. They changed their name, I think, to sort of de-emphasize that around World War I. I
Right.
think it was.
But previously, it was the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and now it's Windsor. So
Windsor, yeah. They made themselves sound more English. But he says Knut sees some interesting advantages in this. He says the king's wife, his mother, his in-laws, his grandchildren, and grandparents are mostly foreigners. He is a ruler and not a leader, a person thoroughly different from the nation, and thus not its embodiment or personification. Now, why is this good? Because he says this is opposed to the monolithic principle of totalitarianism, which is identity, whereas monarchy stands for differentiation. So again, he's bringing home this inequality and difference as a principle, as opposed to, as he spells out later, the dictator will present himself as, hey, I'm just one of you guys. I'm
right.
I'm comrade, right? I'm like your brother, right?
And it should be noted that when you do have those dictators, the thing that they're drawing upon, whether it be we're all the proletariat or we're all the Germans or something like that, it is inherently a uniform identity, and it's an equalizing one as well. It's one that doesn't tolerate much difference. You can't have the Kulaks or the Danes or what have you in that identity. It is only Germans, and oftentimes that identity will grow to encompass other things that were nearby to it and level them as well. Whereas with the monarchs, with the traditional order, it necessitated having multiple identities that were different, that you could take pride in, that sometimes also relied on your ability, so you get both sides there that you do need. You can't neglect one or the other. And it was just overall a better system, allowed differentiation. That is the liberal order that should be defended. It defends liberty.
Okay, so let's see if... I don't think we're going to get to Hoppe. Let's just see if we can finish Knut Ledeen today. That's going to be a stretch right there. Okay, so the next section is called the caricature of monarchy. What does he mean by the caricature? He says modern dictatorships, while democratic in the most classic sense of the term, are also monarchic from a structural as well as from a psychological point of view. Yet, while they are the fulfillment of classic democracy, they are the caricature of traditional monarchy. So his point is, he thinks they come out of democracy. You'll notice that Hitler was one of the people on the Democratic side. Recall that Hitler was actually elected, or he rose to
Right.
power through a democratic process, through a parliamentary democratic process, right? Um, and so Knout-Ledeen argues that the modern dictators are the culmination of democracy, but they're a caricature of monarchy. Okay,
Right.
because monarchy in
And
Europe. Go ahead.
well, make the full point, because I was going to tie this into the opening quote, which I think would dispel a historical myth.
Okay. I'm sorry. Say it
Alright.
again. What?
I said finish making the full point, because
Oh, okay. Okay.
just due to latency, I thought you were done.
Okay. So, right. So he says in Europe, monarchy was always Christian, supranational, because remember the monarchs like married each other across the countries and stuff, right? They were all like each other's cousin or something. Supranational, non-racial, and familialistic. The non-racial point is confusing for people now, where all white Europeans have been thrown into a bucket together. But from the point of view of Europe in the Middle Ages, different races would be like, Spanish, German, English, right? And from that point of view, the monarchs were non-racial. They didn't represent your race. The English king was German. The king of England was German.
Right, and and then like in Spain, you would have a Habsburg, and then an Italian, or a bunch of other people on the throne. The Netherlands had multiple rulers that were from different parts of Germany. You get all of these different. The monarch is still the father of the nation, but not even genetically related to it necessarily.
Okay, so then he goes into something which I was going to skip, and then I realized it was brilliant. Viennese Freudian psychoanalyst from a lecture in 1919. Oh, I'm sorry. You were going to do
Yeah,
something else.
so-
Yeah, go ahead.
And we'll elaborate upon this as we go through. But democracy will descend into just a vague imitation of monarchy in the form of dictatorship, and we've just covered that point kind of in its basic form. He starts this part of the chapter with a quote from Alexander Hamilton, and it's going to sound really weird if you bought into the meme that Alexander Hamilton was a closeted monarchist. Quote, "If we incline to too much democracy, we shall soon shoot into monarchy." Hamilton was not a monarchist, and this says it all right here. He didn't like the populace, but he also didn't like the institution of the monarchy. Hence why he fought on the side that he did, and why he was on, the Federalist side. He was much closer to a full oligarchist than he was to either a Democrat or a monarchist. It just kind of dispels that historical myth right there.
Yeah. Okay, so right. So this psychoanalyst knows that the strength of the father-son relationship. So he comments about the political scene from that point of view. The growth of a new political order, that is the Democratic Republic, is indeed struggling with the greatest psychological handicaps. The patriarchal tendency is inherited, and as I have explained before, intimately connected with all personal ties, such as our relationships to the mother, the wife, the relatives, the paternal friends, occupation, property and labor, religion and ideology. So he's saying the patriarchal tendency is shot through everything in our life, right? Finally, even among those who have now emancipated themselves from the social father-son relationship, the basic attraction to it nevertheless remains so strong that they merely wait for the appearance of a new, similar person who corresponds to their father ideal, and with whom they can enter into a new father-son relationship. This is also the reason why after the fall of monarchies, republics have yielded with great regularity to the rule of a popular leader. Now, I think the classic example of this historically is the French Revolution, which went from killing the king and declaring themselves, republic forever, to, I forget how many years it was, but it wasn't too long till they had Napoleon, right?
Right.
A popular military leader. The father-son motif has suffered a very grave defeat, yet on account of family education and as an inherited sentiment, it is deeply anchored in the hearts of mankind, and will probably this time, too, prevent the establishment of a completely fatherless society. So, writing 100 years ago, he says, you can smash the patriarchy over and over, but you're going to keep on having it recur. It's just, there's maybe adding a little bit to his point here, but I think Canola Dean would say, it just comes back in some warped form, right?
Well, he actually says something very close to that later.
Okay. Oh, well, you were not there yet? Okay. So he says, the personal dictatorship of party leaders became a substitute for the royal institution. The dictators are by and large monarchs minus their essential attributes. Interrelationship. These are the essential attributes of the monarch, he's saying, that the dictators don't have. Mm-hmm. Interrelationship, lack of marital ties within the nation, inheritance of office, absence of vested interests in specific classes, training for the profession. Now, some of this sounds so foreign because we don't know how monarchy actually functioned in Europe, right? It's lost to us, basically.
Right.
So reading this in preparation, I was like, oh yeah, I didn't even know that certain things were just considered, you just don't do that, okay? And one of them is that you tie yourself, like through marriage, to a particular like sector of the society that you're king of. That's like that's a no-no, right? Because now, rather than being sort of above the fray, you're just another contending party in society. And that's not what the monarchs were supposed to be, and they knew it, and it constrained their marital choices, among other things.
Right. He then, if we're ready to continue...
Yeah, please, don't skip the lowly origin bit. That is awesome.
Well, I was going to say...
okay.
Right now, immediately following that quote, he goes on to note that whenever places in Europe do default to a more democratic system, not completely, but leaning that way, you get grand old men or elder statesmen that will start to run and govern the country. Bismarck was one of these people, but so too was just about every continental country had one.
Yeah.
It's just something that happens. They play party politics well, but they also act as the father for the people involved in them. They don't actually, leave their office. They die in it. So, they basically act as a one-generation monarch, if you will. And he goes on to point out that this is just another version of fatherhood, can't be abolished, anything along those lines.
Yeah, actually, that is a good... let me read the exact sentence because it's really good. He says, fatherhood is a fact. It cannot be abolished. So he says it's going to keep popping out. It just might pop out in some sort of distorted version, right? But you're going to keep getting this. And I remember being young and just thinking about the way that people would be worshipful about the president, or this is when I was really young, but people were still like over the moon about JFK even after his assassination, maybe because of his assassination in part. He and his wife, they were so glamorous, and they just went on about them, and I was like, what is going on here? It's like people have a hunger that they're trying to fill. Okay, so he said, again, continuing with this contrast between the democratic, in his view, dictator, and I know that sounds weird, but stay with us. He says the dictator is necessarily of lowly origin, and I'm not knowing what he's referring to in each case here, but he's referring to specific people. Yeah. Okay, I'll read it, and I'll read each one, and you tell me what it is. An ex-seminarian, Stalin, I knew that one. And son of a cobbler.
Or
Oh.
also, the dictator of Slovakia during World War II was a Catholic priest by the name of Josef Tiso. So, while the son of the cobbler gives away that it was Stalin, that ex-seminarian also, kind of
fits that.
happened
Okay.
in two different Slavic countries. Yeah.
Okay, so an ex-seminarian and son of a cobbler, Stalin, as well as
Yeah.
Tiso? Not Tito, you mean Tiso.
Tiso, yes.
Tiso, okay. A postcard painter.
That would be Adolf Hitler.
Okay. A bricklayer.
I couldn't find for sure on this one because I found multiple people that were saying that it applied to different dictators, so I'm not going to say one.
You're not
way or
sure.
the other.
Okay.
I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, and a mechanic.
Same thing with the bricklayer.
Oh, okay. You weren't sure of that.
For whatever reason, whenever you get the more trade kind of, the more tradesmen kind of professions, I guess they confuse them in historical records, but they...
Okay. So, the dictator not only embodies the masses, but he also appeals to the father-son motif.
Yes.
The victorious party, whose leader he is, and Knut keeps emphasizing that with democracies it's about party, and he doesn't seem to view this as a great thing. The victorious party, whose leader he is, endeavors to bring the whole nation under the same ideological denominator, while an additional uniformity of class, race, or ethnic nationality enforced by terror, assassination, or deportation tries desperately to establish a general feeling of fraternity based on identity. The nation of identical brothers is then provided with the father leader, who promises to be more democratic. So this is really fascinating, right? Because what he's saying, he's tying things together that often are not put together, right? So from his point of view, there isn't that much difference between the totalitarian National Socialistic Germany and the totalitarian International Socialistic Soviet Union. From Knut interesting perspective, these things are really extremely similar, and the variant is really quite minor. Namely, what is similar? They're all pushing for uniformity and identity. What is different? Just the vector on which they decide to push for uniformity and identity. In the case of the Soviet Union, it's class. We're all comrades.
Right.
We're all fellow workers or something, right? In the case of National Socialist Germany, it's race or ethnic nationality. I don't know which one you would say they were doing. Maybe they're doing both. And he points out that this need to establish that fraternité, right, coming out of the French Revolution, is so strong that it results in terror, assassination, deportation. The nail that sticks up shall be hammered down or sent to the gulag, right?
Right.
So he says you get this nation of brothers with a father leader. That's the dictatorship model.
Right. And he goes on in the next paragraph. Is it Solovyov?
Soloviev.
Is the name?
Soloviev. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Soloviev. He has the idea of a permanent paternity, where this is finally, I think we've been alluded to. The dictators are mere caricatures, though they make full use of the ineradicable human desire for its realization. So the dictators are a warped figure of the father. They are just a shadow.
But they know they're playing on that. They know they're hooking into that human need, that hole in people's hearts. They're like, hey, I'll fill that place for you. Right.
Right. It's what gives them their popularity a lot of the times. Knut goes on to say, the limitations of the Christian law are absent, and behind the true-hearted, ingenuous eyes of the Führer, the warm twinkle of the Vajda, and the ironically benevolent gaze of the Duce, lurk the horrors of concentration camps, the guillotines, the Chinese death, and the mass graves of nameless victims. Skipping ahead just a little bit. After a democratic interlude, the monarchy returns with a vengeance. returns by the back door, camouflaged, masked, and diabolically perverted. A blood-curdling metamorphosis we know only from nightmares or surrealist films. The reassertion of the natural father urge does not result in the restitution of the paternal kingdom, but in the rise of the terrifying father, a Kronos devouring his own children, who are paralyzed by the magnetic glare like rabbits facing a boa constrictor. Indeed, in the words of E. Junger, decayed altars are inhabited by demons. Still, we have to remember that the rise of the pitless mob masters should not have been impossible without the moral decay of a slavish citizenry.
Would have been impossible without the moral decay.
It would have been. Sorry.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, so he says. I mean, in a way, I think the way to read this, Ryan, right, is that people who believe in democracy are dreaming. They're not being realistic. That there is going to be authority. There is going to be hierarchy. If it's not healthy and natural and organic and bound by, under God, bound by tradition and law and all that, then it'll still be there, but it'll be in a sort of demonic, twisted form, right? That is unbound by by God, by morality, by law, and monstrous, right?
Yes, there are certain facts of life that have been handed down to us as they should be, and if you decide to throw it away, it does not change the fact that it does exist and it should be there. So then now you have to build it back up from the ground up without any knowledge that's been handed down to you because you threw it out. You're going to get it wrong as you try to resurrect it.
Right.
And it's going to be bad.
And so just finishing that thought real quick, he says, according to Plato, the transition from democracy to tyranny is a natural and almost unavoidable process. And he says, what does it all add up to? Over a long period of time, democracy is just an exchange of elites or dynasties. So you just end up going from the Bourbon monarchs. I think that's what they were called, right? The French monarchs before the French Revolution. Bourbon monarchs to the Napoleon and Napoleon III, right? It's a long, painful route back to monarchy, is what he's saying. Back to some kind of father leader. Okay. I'm going to skip that. Okay. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, you didn't want to miss this. In masses, there is moreover a strongly feminine essence manifesting itself in irrationality and the supremacy of emotions over reason. This is one of the things we've been AAs and friends have been getting into with the perennial traditionalists. Reason as a sort of a masculine thing, emotion is more feminine. Obviously, Jordan Peterson would tell you that you balance these elements in any given individual, right? But you get his point. Okay. Right, and he says, go ahead.
And then about democracy, he will say the fraternal and matriarchal elements, so strong in all democratic civilizations, far outweigh the patriarchal factor. In masses, there is the feminine essence. So that is basically just what we've been saying this entire time. The anti-rational, the indecision, the mob rule, that is the feminine nature of all of that. That is the democratic civilization. And it is completely contrasted with the patriarchal civilization under monarchy.
Yeah, or you could talk about, again, I'm thinking of Jordan Peterson, yin and yang, chaos and order, right? So right. The patriarchal element brings in that sort of orderliness, and then you get this chaos, if you prefer to think, if that's easier to think about. Some people, when you talk about sort of the idealized masculine, feminine, some people take it personally. So if it helps you, think about it in terms of like chaos and order or something. Okay, so
right.
He says, the question which truly liberal nations have to ask themselves is simply this. In any given country, what form of government offers the relatively best guarantee for the preservation of a reasonable maximum of individual freedom? So he says, if your goal is individual flourishing, individual freedom. You need to be a little bit open-minded about how to get there. He's been arguing that democracy is not that way. Now, monarchy compared with democracy. Okay, now in this section, he has about 20 points, 30 points. It's a lot. And a number of them...
It's a 30-point list.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
a number of them are very good.
For a cigar stream.
Yes. We could just do this in detail. But we're going to try to zoom through it a little bit with the idea that hopefully we're giving you enough of a taste that you want to go and seek this book out yourself. Okay, so 1. Monarchy is by its nature disassociated from party rule. Remember, he doesn't like this, the emphasis of the party. And notice that in dictatorships, hey, all I am is the leader of the party. I'm not the king. I'm just the leader of the party. Right. Yeah, but the party is everything in this kind of state, right? So democracy, he says, is by nature party rule. The president or prime minister is a party man. He lacks general backing. And we definitely see that right now. I mean, it's getting... I guess it's been this way for some time. I don't think of Nixon, right? But, well, that's not fair because everybody voted for him, which they don't tell us. But, think of, they talk about how partisan things are getting. I mean, that's part of a reflection of this, right? Which is that half the country hates Trump and then the other half hates Biden, right? So it's that you don't have someone with a general support like in Britain, I think. There'd maybe be sort of a general respect for the Queen. We don't really have anything like that in our very democratic situation in the U.S., for example.
Right, and this was the downfall of the Founding Fathers, was that they refused to recognize, or some of them did recognize to their credit, but the majority of them refused to recognize that you could not have a voting system that did not devolve into party politics. In his farewell address, Washington famously warned against organizing into parties. But, even in the fact that he could see it was a bad thing, he couldn't make the connection that if you give people a vote, they are going to form into parties. Yeah. It happens even in small votes as well. You'll have different groups that will associate with each other and vote for this specific way. This was the downfall of the American constitutional system, was that they refused to recognize this.
Right. Okay, point 2. The monarch is the political and social head of the nation. The president of the U.S., on the other hand, is decidedly not a social leader. The monarch can, unlike a Republican leader, rule not only through the mechanism of the laws, but also through his prestige. So this, again, it's like you need to read a lot of history for this to make any sense to you. But the idea is that the king can doesn't always have to pass a law. He can just sort of set the tone, and people sort of follow along, right, without being coerced by a legal mechanism, but more by setting an example, basically, right?
Literally, just call in favors, yeah.
Right, and we talk about the president in the U.S. Setting an example and stuff, but yeah, I don't know. Let's hope people aren't trying to be like Trump or Biden. Anyway, okay. 3. Even a monarch of mediocre talents and natural gifts has the advantage of having received an education for his profession. Now, this is something Hoppe talks about as well. To some degree, it's just random, right? The king has a son. The first son is going to be the next king. You might get a nice guy. You might get a bad guy. But they do have training for being a king, right? Their whole life is sort of geared towards the role they'll take.
Right.
And then he says, but with democracy, on the other hand, you only get sort of hasty technical training. And then he talks about to try to fix this, with the idea that anyone can become the president, right? To try to fix this, then that means you've got to educate everybody, which isn't really realistic. So he says, caught between the Charybdis of intellectual qualifications for the franchise and the Scylla of an orgy of emotional irrationalism, Democrats steer their course towards the noble goal of education and brains for all. So he says that's part of the thing that's pushing us, if you've noticed, that everyone's got to go to college and stuff, right?
Right. So, there was came out of the Reformation the idea that everyone should have an education, but this is different because what the Democrats are arguing for here is that everyone should be indoctrinated into the civic system, whereas this more, religious idea was you need to be able to perform your vocation that you've been divinely ordained to do.
Mm-hmm.
So don't confuse the two if you go digging.
Okay, not going to go. I didn't highlight as much in this fourth point. He just says that the education of the ideal monarch is not only intellectual but moral and spiritual. The democratic leader coming into power.
Yeah, that's what I had highlighted.
Yeah, the democratic leader coming into power is always unprepared. With the king, his training begins practically at the cradle. I'm going to try to move pretty fast here. Number 5, kingship is not only an office with religious implication. For example, the coronation of a Catholic ruler is a sacrament. It's sacramental. It's like a religious ceremony, right? But the whole traditional Christian monarchy was deeply imbued with a religious spirit. The respect for the human person and the rights of the subjects were strongly emphasized in the education of a ruler. See, again, you wouldn't know that, right? You'd think that all they're going to be taught is,
right,
how do you squeeze the most out of everybody, right? Well, he's claiming that what you actually see, if you look at the education of a prince, is that they're taught about like the dignity of their subjects. That's interesting.
Right.
Okay, number 6, the ruling families all intermarried and forming a single breed, right? They're sort of like unto themselves, not of the same race as the people they're ruling over, but more of the royal race, you might say. Blue bloods, right? That's what they called them, blue bloods.
Sure.
The ruling families had biologically a better qualification for their profession than the average man. Now, Ryan wondered if we should talk about this. Was this the part, or is he going to hit this more later?
Yeah, this is the part where I said it might be a bit too spicy to just throw out there, but
well, what does AA say? Disavow, disavow. We're just telling you what Colonel Ladine says, right? Okay. It seems to be a proven fact that there is a noticeable difference in the IQs of different social classes, and heredity, rather than environment, here plays the determining role.
Right.
And I don't know. I think that has continued to be what they've come up with when they're allowed to do such research. That
right. Yes.
Smart, high IQ people tend to have high IQ children. Okay. Yes. So 7, monarchy in the Christian world is an international institution. Let's see. I'm not sure what I want to highlight from this section. Let's see. Any thoughts from this section we want to share?
We could just summarize it in saying international in the fact that it was a universally adopted idea, not as a system imposed internationally, like you might think of democracy being an international institution. So, I mentioned earlier in the stream, each different kingdom had a different set of laws that accompanied it. It was different in its own way, in the Christian world. This is that. So all of Europe was monarchical except for like tiny exceptions. But it was still an international institution. It was an idea or a system that naturally evolved internationally.
Right, and they intermarried internationally, right? So they're not just they're connected they're connected across borders. Okay, number 8. This brings that up. Monarchs, unlike democratic leaders, are ethnically mixed. They are usually of foreign origin. Their relatives are foreign. Democracy and nationalism, on the other hand, are closely related and interdependent. Notice, by the way, this is something that can feel a little unfamiliar because lately it seems like people calling themselves nationalists have wanted to be a bulwark against international tyranny. So it's a little hard to get your head back into Canola Dean's point of view, where he's not real thrilled about nationalism. Nationalism is associated with the French Revolution in his mind. This huge emphasis on the nation, the will of the general will, the national will, that sort of thing, right? He's not very sympathetic to that. Okay, 9, monarchy is also interracial. Okay. Number 10.
Throw out any modern connotations you may have with the word. And go read the book for a much longer description.
Right. Yeah, well, but generally he's just saying that they're not from
Right.
they're not
Frederick
representing
the Great
they're not
was
representing
a Frenchman, yes.
Yeah, Frederick the Great was French. Yeah. The German monarch. So, or the monarch of Germany. So 10, the monarchic principle is a uniting, not a dividing principle. Every election, on the other hand, is a solemn manifestation of division. And man, are we feeling that at this point, right?
Right.
It feels like every time votes come around, everybody's ready. It feels like people are going to start shooting each other in the streets or something, right? I mean, it's like scary.
I think they probably already have.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think it has happened. Okay, so 11, neither is a sound monarchy oligarchical, as democracy is by necessity, and aristocracy by nature. Okay, let's see. These next few points I actually didn't highlight. Did you find 12 or 13 interesting? I'm happy to just skip some.
No, the next one I had highlighted was point number 15.
Let's go to it.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
Since monarchy is rule from above, and thus does not have to exercise horizontal pressure, because it has that, there's no need to use it if you don't need to, the meekness attribute to it, it is by its nature more liberal than democracy. And here we reach the central point of why monarchy would be better than democracy from the point of view of an arch-liberal. He goes on to write, just because monarchs cannot constantly refer to mandates received from the people, their radius of action is psychologically more limited than that of democratic leaders. Even a Louis XVI would
14th,
probably have
14th.
been... 14th, sorry, I can't read today for whatever reason. Louis XIV would probably have been slain 24 hours after proclaiming prohibition. And George III might have been quartered by the staunchest Tories had he dared to impose laws which are promulgated as a matter of routine by modern parliaments.
Yeah, so this is a really unfamiliar idea.
That is your central thesis.
Yeah, this is a really unfamiliar idea because we are anachronistic, typically, when we look back at kings. And we project backwards democratic totalitarianism, basically. And so it's hard to understand that the whole structure was just totally different, and the expectations were different, and the limitations were different. They couldn't, like I said, they couldn't just do whatever they wanted to do. Whereas now, hey, I represent all of us, and how can we be restricted from doing whatever we want to do? We are the people. We are the people, the sovereignty of the people, or as the French revolutionaries talked about, the general will, becomes a principle that is not checked by anything. You can just do anything in the name of the people, it seems. Whereas the king is under God and has other kinds of limitations, right?
Right. So, and as they were describing here, the king, just from the moment that he takes up the reins of his throne to the point that he dies, is ultimately responsible to his subjects for being that fatherly figure. And if he goes to them and says, I'm going to enact the most intrusive law you've ever heard of, or I'm going to ban the sale and consumption of alcohol, he's not going to live.
Yeah.
He's just not going to live. And the fact that the progressive movement, the fact that they came from a democracy is not an accident. It is the only way that you can have them arise.
Polite in the chat has given me the right words here. When people imagine absolute monarchies, they imagine all the power of a modern state held by one person, which is terrifying, but ahistorical. Right?
Right.
That is excellently put. That is exactly our problem. we picture our situation and we go, okay, but like a king has all that power, right? That's what monarchy would be. And that's not what monarchy was.
That's what, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Let's see. Let's see.
I mean, that's most of the of like the really hard hitting points. I
Oh, okay.
would say that we're probably good to just tell people to go read the rest for themselves, because there's
Oh,
a good,
okay.
5 pages left in this. So it'd be good for some self-study. Unless
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm
something.
done. I'm going to skip around to a few
Okay.
things that jump out to me.
All right.
This one, 21. The monarch is a responsible person. Okay.
Okay.
The fact that a monarch is responsible to God alone rather than to an assembly or a popular majority is rather shocking to an agnostic mind. But while God cannot be fooled, the masses can. And so he says,
So
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I didn't want to propagate that point with the others, because I thought that this is historically a weak point, because it's a weak point because you will get kings that just don't care about God. They obviously have not turned out well in what comes after death, but it does still happen nonetheless.
No. But I don't think that's his point. He's talking about the structure of the system.
Right.
He's
he
talking
has
about
responsibilities.
He's talking about responsibility and accountability.
Right.
Right. Whereas
So-
the Democratic leader, as Hoppe is going to really drive home, has responsibility for a brief time, but doesn't really have accountability.
Right.
Right.
So
So that's what
I
he's
see the point
contrasting.
I'm trying to make there, but
Yeah, I don't think it's dependent on the God part. He that's just a little
Okay.
side point. Okay, so he says in a voting situation, he says the demo Republican government derives its authority from anonymous, secretly voting masses on a purely numerical basis. It is even impossible to trace the empowering individual, that is, the individual who voted for whatever it is, right? And thus we get what
Right.
French authors call the cult of irresponsibility. The electees, rejecting all responsibility, can easily blame the electors for their mandates. Thus we get today the immoral idea of making whole nations responsible for the deeds and misdeeds of their rulers, regardless of whether these had majority support or not. This collective judgment of moral acts is one of the greatest maladies of the democratic age. Well, that really hits home for me, because what is he contrasting here? He's saying that the king has personal responsibility. He's a responsible person, right? So the king is held accountable.
Right.
And as he said, the king might be held accountable by being assassinated in some cases, right? Which Hoppe also emphasizes the possibility of the role of assassination in the system of monarchy. So the king has responsibility, but in democracy, everyone can point to everybody else. No one's really responsible, but also everyone's responsible. And of course, the heartbreaking aspect of that, the thing that makes the 20th century such a terrifying history, is collective punishment, right?
right.
The German people say are responsible because it's a democratic system, right? In the broadest sense, it's a democratic system, so they're responsible for everything Hitler does, and so we can bomb civilians and kill women and children, and drive them out of Czechoslovakia after the war, and right.
Right.
Hiroshima, Nagasaki, all of these things, I think, are bound up with what he's getting at here. It's
It's the
all where
the idea.
no one person is responsible, and therefore kind of everyone ends up being responsible. And this also is the idea underlying sanctions, which is an issue that particularly bothers me. The United States uses sanctions, which literally are for basically like starving people to death. This is being used in Yemen, for example, with the support of the United States.
Right, and with the bombing of civilians and all that being justified, the other common thing was, well, if they didn't want to be bombed, they shouldn't have let them get in there, or something like that. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not my responsibility, and it shouldn't be, but
Right.
because of the warped system, you get to say that it is now, and now you're bombing children in hospitals and all this other stuff.
Okay, here's that point 22. In 22, it has that point I was mentioning. It says he's classless. The monarch is without tie. He says the alliance of the dynasty with a specific class from a specific region was considered to be incompatible with the principle of monarchic impartiality and neutrality. Royalty is thus practically forced to marry outside of the country. Okay, so you don't want to be tied to a particular group, whereas now, of course, the connection between politicians and special interests has become a joke. People will say, Republican from Monsanto or something like that, right? To say how closely tied someone is to some specific interest. The monarch is meant to be sort of above that. Okay, what else should we hit on before we stop? Well, 23, Hoppa's going to drive home really well, so I'm not going to worry about that. This is an important one.
25?
Hoppa's going to... Okay, well, 24 is going to be Hoppa as well, so we'll skip that. Go ahead, 25.
Yeah. Monarchy, coupled with a bureaucracy, is intrinsically better adapted to the complex modern age, demanding special skills and knowledges, than a shifting democratic officialdom. So this seems quaint and outdated to us because we have the idea of the deep state where it just stays there and doesn't move. But at the time, whenever a new party got in, they still understood that if you keep the other guy's bureaucracy in, you're not going to get anything done, so you have to clean it out and get your own guys in, yada yada.
Right.
You keep shifting everything, and it's ultimately inefficient on a governing scale, and governance is a thing that does need to happen. So, either way, you're stuck with the deep state, terrible, or you're stuck with an ever-revolving cohort of bureaucrats, also bad in its own right. Monarchy, on the other hand, responsible to the monarch, which we've already discussed, has a lot of moral and faith responsibility placed upon them, and it is actually qualified, which is something that you're seeing less and less of in modern bureaucracies.
Right. Okay, well, I think that's covers the main points I wanted to make sure we hit out of these 30. There's many other interesting things. He talks about, then after these 30 points, he talks about, tries to explain a little bit more why Americans find it difficult to take monarchy seriously. Again, he says the rise of our Christian civilization took place under the aegis of monarchy. The anti-monarchic currents in the last 160 years had a more or less anti-Catholic, if not, as in many cases, an anti-Christian character. So the objection to... He's saying monarchy and Christianity were together all those years in Europe. And they kind of got attacked together in our modern age.
Right. And that's how you can see whenever the Russian Revolution and then eventually the Civil War fires off. A lot of the people that were from the get-go anti-czarist were also anti-clerical and would be the ones during the Civil War that were hunting down priests and members of the Orthodox clergy and just burying them in shallow graves. And you see this in Spain as well. The people that upheld the traditional institutions were lumped in together with the monarchy. And then in Catalonia, whenever this war kicked off, the anti-monarchists, or the communists, just had a mass execution of priests, and it was very bloody. You see this anywhere where these ideas reach their conclusion in violence. Right.
Okay, so... I shared this on Twitter, so let me share it with a little bit with you all to finish this up. At the end of this chapter, before he gets into a supplementary note, which we're not going to cover, he says, neither is it sheer coincidence that in the latest war, he's referring to World War II, the Church has received abuse from all sides and has suffered most grievously and unjustly in a struggle which was, in a sense, the fratricidal strife between the three heirs of the French Revolution. Ready? Democratic nationalism, that would be like the US, say. National Socialism, Germany. Right. Socialist Internationalism, Soviet Union. All of them claiming to be the sole and only embodiment of true democracy. So he's saying in World War II, monarchies were not even in the fight anymore. I mean, those were pretty much destroyed by World War I or soon after. By World War II, right. You basically have various people all proclaiming themselves as, I really represent the people, the demos, right? Stalin represents. I saw someone in the comments right. saying, hey, but they weren't really democratic. Yeah, well, I think you need to try on Knut Ledeen's lenses here. He's saying that they certainly weren't monarchical. Or in what sense was the Bolshevik or the Bolsheviks like the traditional European monarchies, right? Or Hitler and the National Socialist Party. How much were they like traditional monarchies? Not very much, but they were kind of a lot like Napoleon after the French Revolution. Right? Go ahead.
Right, and part of Knut Ledeen's lens is also being eminently familiar with the writings of these internationalists, the National Socialists, and the Democratic Nationalists. We weren't the only side that had a strong affinity for democracy. The NSDAP has a long list for most of its members. Most of them were very prolific writers, where they talked about, how National Socialism from the NSDAP is the true manifestation of democracy. And then in the Soviet Union, much more well known than the NSDAP, they would talk about how their elections and their democratic system was how democracy should be. And that's why the Soviet Union maintained a system of sham elections where, only one person could run, but if they didn't get a majority, then they got kicked out and probably sent to Siberia. Each of these systems were very well predicated on the idea that they were the true democracy.
Yeah, I feel like this was a challenging text for everyone. Knut Ledeen is steeped in a tradition that has been strangled by modernity. I would say the United States itself played a big role.
Right.
I mean, just think of James T. Kirk, going around the galaxy saying, well, the Prime Directive says I shouldn't interfere, but I'm going to destroy this monarchy and replace it with a democracy. That's what on the international stage, something America seemed to be involved with over and over again.
Right.
So Knut Ledeen is trying to get us to time travel and see a little bit of what a system that all the European peoples lived under for hundreds and hundreds of years, see a little bit of what it was actually like as opposed to the caricature of it that we're given when we're taught about those times. We're taught about what monarchies were like. Or, and this is also a danger, to project backwards our own experience of the mass democratic state or even the totalitarian state and figure that was pretty much what a monarchy was like. It's just that it was a king instead of a president or a king instead of Stalin or something. And he's saying, no. Right. This was a completely different web of understanding in terms of seeing the society as a set of families and the king as sort of a father over fathers or something like that, right? It's just a completely different way of looking at things. More hierarchical, less egalitarian, more differentiated, less flattening in terms of identity, and hey, we're all just folks, right? I ought to be able to drink a president with the beer, or drink a beer with the president.
Yes.
Because he should just be kind of a regular guy like me, right? As we all know, the presidents have not been regular guys. It generally, right? So that's all been an illusion anyway, but it's been a toxic illusion, I think. So anyway, I don't know what else to say. I think this is challenging stuff for us, for all of us.
Right, and you also need to have the material from the previous stream in order to see how this is a comparison with democracy. Because we've talked a lot about monarchy here, but the last stream that we did of this, we talked a lot about egalitarianism and how liberty fares under a uniform system, democracy, specifically that it doesn't. So I think this has been a good series so far.
Okay, yes, and I think the next step, I had it prepped for today. I don't think Ryan did, so it'd be better to give him a chance anyway. But Hapa has a chapter on democracy and monarchy, and don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think having gotten that sort of shock to our system of Knut Ledeen coming at things from such a different sort of a cultural, anthropological way, I think, almost, it might almost feel comforting to have Hapa's take on it, where he comes at things in a very step-by-step rational way, but he sees a lot of the same things Knut Ledeen sees about monarchy versus democracy.
Right.
He just comes at it from a different angle, in part because he's coming at it as an economist. Right. So let's read. Oh, wow. Here we go. Okay. Leo Borealis has made a tip on Subscribestar. He made a quite large tip, and he gave me quite a large text to share. So here we go. The great problem with discussing monarchy is that the subject becomes warped by modern perceptions. The regimes envisioned become either those of high medieval despots or the merchant princes of the Renaissance, lords of the ashes, long in dereliction of the duties of the monarch. The primary focus of the monarch is as pontifex, the builder of bridges, paths to the transcendent. The idea that material might makes right is an absolute perversion. Spiritual might and clarity of purpose makes right in tradition. Evola writes, the roots of authority always had a metaphysical character. Likewise, the idea that the power to govern is conferred upon the rex, the king, by those whom he rule, and that his authority is the expression of the community and therefore subject to its decrees, was entirely foreign to tradition. Close quote on Evola. The king is the solar aspect from whose guidance and example the people can walk the path towards communion with the transcendent. For the path is not a level field, but a hierarchy, and few are the men that can find the true path without a guide. The king must do all this, or be perverted into the inversion of the king archetype, the shadow king, entirely focused on the material realm, living in eternal fear and shame of the transcendent, to the horrific detriment of his people. Well, I don't know what I can say about it, but that was a beautiful passage, worthy of thinking about at more length. Any comments? I know I just threw that at you.
No, I don't think I have anything that could be worth commenting on.
Okay. Yes. I think there's very interesting things in there, and it's interesting. I hadn't thought about Evola writing about. Okay, wait a second. I had not thought about Evola writing on monarchy, but that actually sounds quite interesting to get his perspective.
Right, and because it's him, I would actually have to look at it and analyze it in order to give give an answer that isn't just fluff or something that's wrong.
Okay, so Sam153 says a tip in favor for His Majesty. I don't know which majesty he has in mind. Maybe me as King of the Moon. I don't know. And then let's go to Super Chats. Okay, let me make sure I'm not missing anything from past weeks. Yeah, we got that one. Okay, so from today, The Prudentialist, can't catch it live, looking forward to it later. Thank you, sir. Esoterrorist, Turnip will be king one day. Rock Paladin says, I think the Habsburg monarchy had a pretty ideal structure. Each country within the patchwork of feudal titles were highly autonomous and federalized. Yeah, that is a whole topic. Well, I mean, I think our friend Apostolic Majesty is the one who has probably been addressing this, right?
Yes.
But there was there were
Right.
peoples under the Habsburg monarchy. It wasn't a unified, everybody the same ethnicity or anything. They weren't even the same religion, right? And the Austro-Hungarian
Right.
Empire, didn't it? It had Christians and it had
Correct,
Muslims,
yes.
and yeah, and it functioned for a long time.
So the way that worked was, yeah, even in Austria up until about the end of the 30 Years' War, they were majority Protestant, just from like the wildfire of the Reformation. That got essentially bred out, if you will. The Kingdom of Hungary had a very large subsection of Protestant evangelicals. There were parts of Poland that did as well, that were in the Austrian Empire. The Transylvanians, had Protestants as well. And then you had Muslims that were in a different part of the Balkans. You had Roman Catholics. You had Hussites that were still kind of hanging on in Bohemia by the time they fell under the Habsburg crown. So that predates the Protestant Reformation. You had all of these different things that were there. You had Calvinists, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Muslims, Hussites, everything, and it managed to stay together much longer than the United States has.
Yeah, I mean, it went on for a long time, so, I don't know how you can complain about it from that point of view, from stability. Okay, and then I think I've got some side chats from someone else, but we've hit our super chats and tips. Thanks, everybody, for that. I know this was a little bit different than our usual streams, a little more... Knut Ledeen was a painter. And I think he has a way of coming at things, which is I enjoy a lot. By the way, I enjoy reading Knut Ledeen. I find him. I hope you have the same experience, Ryan. It's
Right.
rich.
Yeah.
It's a rich experience to read him.
Yes,
Right. Yeah.
I would highly recommend everyone to go and read it because, I mean, even just for the literary quality, it reads like poetry.
Right. Right. He writes in a more impressionistic way, you might say. But as I said, it also is so human, I mean, I think we're going to find that Hoppe brings really great insights to this topic, but it's a little more mechanical, a little more step by step. It's very rigorous, and that's, I think, of great value.
Yes.
But Knut Ledeen leaves you with like a feeling, right? Hoppe will leave you with ideas, but Knut Ledeen starts giving you a sense like you're getting a little breath of the air of a previous age. You're getting a little bit of a hint as to what life was actually like, 800 years ago in Europe or whatever, which is really has felt lost to us. We're so cut off from our past, right? Which it doesn't have to be this way, by the way. Many people in parts of the world, they have this connection to their past such that something that happened 800 years ago will feel like it almost happened yesterday to them. It's so present in the mind of that people, right? This significant event that happened. I'm thinking of, for example, the turning back of a Muslim invasion in Hungary, I think it was. Anyway, I remember being there in Prague.
Places, yeah.
Yeah, but I remember being there and seeing their memory of that. And you could just feel that this didn't feel like so long ago. Whereas for us, 800 years ago, what was it like to be, my ancestors were from Scotland, basically, right? What was it like to be under a Scottish king 800 years ago in Scotland? I mean, it feels so far away. Like, I don't know what life seemed like to those people. Knut Ledeen helps me get a little bit of that, this family-oriented culture, this culture oriented towards Christianity, right? A culture that didn't have this huge emphasis on the people and the egalitarianism that now has reached insane levels in our society. Go ahead.
One that wasn't atomized. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And had actual role models and rulers as well.
Right.
Something that's just completely gone for most people today.
Right. Yeah, and with tradition, maybe some traditions that were a bit felt annoying and oppressive, but also some sense of guidance. Whereas now, you go to pursue a woman, and it's like, how do you even do it if you're trying to be, a little more traditional and respectful, right? How do you even pursue a woman anymore? How do you do a courtship ritual at this point? Like, it's just been totally destroyed in our culture. We've lost so much.
Right.
So yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to bring home that there's some value in reading Conal Ledeen separate from political theory. Right.
Right.
He's giving you a little chance to soak in the European heritage culture. The culture of our European heritage. Those of us
Right.
who hail back to a European descent in some form. Okay. Anyway, that's all. Let's try and actually do credits this time. They kind of go up the screen in a sort of jerky way, but let's do it. Please subscribe to the channel. I hope you found this interesting, challenging. Hapa, I think for some people would be considered challenging. After this Conal Ledeen, I think you're going to find Hapa goes down really easy. It's very simple, not simple, but it's very logical and step by step. You can really follow. Conal Ledeen tends to kind of be all over the place in a way. So I was really enjoying reading both of them, but they're just such different experiences, even though they really arrive at the exact same place in terms of their analysis of these different democratic systems. So looking forward to more on that. We'll probably do Econ Minis next week. Well, I don't know. I'm almost tempted to go right into Hapa because I'm ready, and I bet you could be ready. Would that be too much of a burden, Ryan?
If I just had an afternoon, I'll be ready for the Hapa.
Okay. Why don't we change it up a bit, and let's go right. We'll kind of treat it as a part 2. We might even use the same thumbnail. Should we do that? I don't know. We'll ask our producer. But we'll just treat this as like a part 2. I might even just call it Monarchy versus Democracy Part 2, Hapa or something. I don't know. And let's just consider that a continuation of what we did tonight. I think you'll see how even though they come at this from very different angles, it all ends up fitting together in an amazing way. All the things that we've been learning from Conal Ledeen, Hapa then, it's like a puzzle pieces. All will fall into place as we understand these two systems in contrast. Okay, so I think that's it. Please subscribe. Our main support for the show, which I just took huge advantage of. Thank you, everybody. Just spent a lot of money, and it all came from you guys. Oh, okay. I think I used $100 of my own personal money, but otherwise it was all from contributions to the show, either through Bitcoin or at Subscribestar primarily, and Super Chats, of course. So really appreciate the support. It really paid off. And let's